Hello, it's me again. Today we are going to talk about John Locke. To begin talking about Locke, however, let's review a little bit because the interplay between Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who we talked about last time, is one of the famous ways of teaching this is by comparing and contrasting these two thinkers, right? So a little bit of review. Remember from Hobbes, he wrote this book called The Leviathan, and that he lays out his vision of what the perfect government is. And spoiler alert, the perfect government, according to Hobbes, is an absolute monarchy, right? It's perfect not because the king is born to be our king and to rule us and is made of better stock than we are and so on, but that it's in our own best interest to back somebody who wields absolute power over us, because only that person is capable of keeping us from the state of nature, right? And the purpose of government for Locke is to keep us from the state of nature by enforcing the promises and the contracts that we make between each other, enforcing the laws, right? So Hobbes's book Leviathan is a very highly controversial and well-read book in his own era. It makes everybody angry, right? Remember I talked last time about how he thought he was kind of negotiating a peace between the two sides in the English Civil War, between the parliamentarians and the royalists, right? It turns out, though, the Leviathan pisses both sides off. They're both very, very angry, and people are publishing all sorts of books castigating Hobbes, and he has to go into exile. Right? Doesn't hurt the sale of his book, by the way, but it does make it difficult for him to get by, right, or to have a place to live that's stable. Locke is Locke comes a generation later, also from England. By Locke's time, it's pretty clear the political fallout from the English Civil War in the 1640s, which was just the beginning of half a century of major political upheaval and a Game of Thrones in England. Locke is towards the end of the 1600s. Locke is writing at a time, however, where there is a real flourishing of the kind of intellectual ability that in the next century is going to turn into the Enlightenment. Right? Locke is friends with Isaac Newton, for instance, and Robert Boyle. I think his first name's Robert. Of Boyle's Law, if you've taken chemistry, right? So he has a lot of scientific friends, and he's a contemporary and an intellectual in those circles, right? So, and of course a reader of Hobbes. So, but Locke is going to take his own pass at the project that Hobbes engaged in. Remember, the Hobbes project was trying to answer the question, what is the ideal form of government? What kind of government can last? What kind of government can give us what we really want from government, right? And is strong enough to be the guardian, a strong enough guardian for us that we don't go through these cycles of revolutions, right? Locke is also interested in these kinds of questions. The question, as he lays out in the first paragraph of the reading for tonight, he says, what kind of political what kind of political unions are just, right? What is the good kind of government, right? And his way of going about answering this question, he's going to borrow, if not steal, Hobbes' methodology. Hobbes had this as I said, he had this very famous methodology where he starts out when there's no government. He starts out in this sort of kind of thought experiment where, okay, imagine there's a situation where there's no government. Imagine the state of nature. and then he's going to tell a story kind of step by step of how it is we start out in a state of nature and we work our way towards a civilized society, right? So Locke is going to use that same strategy. Locke is going to arrive at a very different conclusion than Hobbes did. In his conclusion, the differences in their conclusion is going to be mirrored by differences in their starting point. Now, they both are going to have, in theory, the same starting point. They're going to imagine life in the state of nature. But the assumptions they make about life in the state of nature are notably very, very different and responsible for the, at least in part, the different conclusions they draw, right? So imagine the state of nature. Go to that desert island where we're all crash landed. There is no government. There are no laws. And we all have to work it out between each other what our society is going to be like and who's going to do what and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so Locke thinks that if we imagine the state of nature, the conditions that people live in when there is no law or government, he thinks that the situation is not nearly as bad, Locke thinks, as Hobbes assumed that it would be. Locke doesn't start from a place, remember Hobbes, when he thought about the state of nature, he thought of England during the Civil War, where just overnight everybody was killing everybody else and taking their stuff, right? Locke has a different idea of what life in the state of nature might be. What is it like? Well, when Locke imagines a state of nature, he doesn't imagine life during wartime. Instead, what he imagines are the stories that are coming from the New World, North and South America, of pioneers out on the edge of civilization, going out beyond where there are roads, beyond where there are trading posts, beyond where there's any sort of society, staking their claim, building a little house, starting a little farm, hunting in the forest whenever they like, and getting along in the grand American tradition of just wanting to move out into the forest and being left alone, right? And Locke thinks, well, what is life like in that situation? Well, Locke thinks in the first case, it's very clearly is a state of equality, right? Out there in the forest, you don't leave all of your political titles behind out there in the forest. The truth is, everybody there are no leaders and there are no subjects. It's just everybody trying to get along, right? So Locke so far mostly agrees with Hobbes on that, right? So Locke also thinks that, and he really emphasizes in a way that Hobbes might agree but wouldn't emphasize. Locke thinks that life in this state of nature is a state of freedom. It's a state where we can do whatever we want. We spend our days hunting or fishing or working to clothe ourselves or to build our house. But spare time as it comes is left up to us to decide for how we want to spend it. You can spend your day however you like once your chores are done, so to speak. And we use our ability to take the things that we need from nature, right? Out there in the forest, we are surrounded by this forest that is filled with resources. It doesn't care who takes its resources. It favors one person just as much as the next. How much we take of it, what we're able to take, is entirely up to us, our own intelligence and our own appetites and so on. So far, mostly agrees with Hobbes. Hobbes, of course, doesn't think the state of nature is really a state of freedom. I mean, it's a state of freedom to run around in the forest and try to keep from, kill as many people before they kill you. But for Hobbes, that doesn't seem like a wonderful way to live. Quite the opposite. He thinks that's the worst possible way to live. Locke, on the other hand, thinks life in the state of nature isn't that bad so far. There are some problems. We'll get to those a little bit later. But Locke generally thinks that life is not bad in the state of nature. Why it isn't bad, and here's where he's really going to disagree with Hobbes. Life in the state of nature isn't that bad, for Locke says, because the truth is, according to Locke, we all have this natural knowledge that other people that we are not the masters of other people, that other people should be left alone in the same way that we mostly want to be left alone. And what this amounts to is that Locke thinks that there is a natural moral law that is applicable to all human beings, all rational beings. Recognize that we should not interfere with other people with regard to their life, their liberty, or their possessions, right? So you thought I was going to say pursuit of happiness, didn't you? Right? We'll come back to that a little later. But no, life, liberty, and possessions, Locke says. We all know naturally that people have a natural moral right to these things. That means that even out there on that desert island, we all just naturally understand that, hey, I shouldn't bother you or kill you and take your stuff or try to make you work for me, and you just leave me alone too, right? Maybe we agree to help each other once in a while. Then again, maybe we don't. But mostly we respect each other's distance and respect each other's stuff. And Locke thinks that this changes the whole thing. This changes the whole game. If people naturally have if they're naturally drawn to if they're natural havers and respecters of moral rights, then that totally changes Hobbes's whole scheme, Hobbes's whole story. Because then we don't need, we are not in these desperate straits, terrified of, desperate to get out of the state of nature and always living our lives every moment of every day in terror that we're ever going to go back there, right? We're not going to have this unlimited, metaphysical allegiance to anybody who can keep us from the state of nature. So this would change everything. This would change, as I said, the Hobbes' whole story. What Locke needs now, though, I mean, if you're partial to Hobbes, you might say, well, now wait a second. Hobbes gave a story that might seem pretty ruthless, but also it seemed pretty plausible in a lot of ways. It seems like we would be warring for resources and only wanting for ourselves, and only begrudgingly begin to restrain ourselves and agree to promises, right? And begin and agree to laws. So if Locke is going to have a better alternative story to this, he first and foremost needs to answer the question of, well, now wait a second. Remember, back on that island, there were all the mangoes in the trees, and those mangoes don't belong to anybody yet, right? But who's to say who those mangoes ever belong to, right? I mean, if I run up and I take all the mangoes and I run off into the forest, is that wrong on a desert island? And who's to say that that's wrong? What makes it wrong? Hobbes, remember, said there's nothing wrong. There's not a damn thing in the world with stealing all the mangoes on the island. If there are no laws out in the state of nature. But Locke instead says, well, even in the state of nature, there are these moral laws. So how do we decide, according to Locke, who gets what? Whose mangoes belong to who? Locke's answer to this question is that, well, objects are acquired through labor, he says. So the mangoes in the trees don't belong to anybody. Everybody is equally entitled to them. But when, Jason, I go and I say, how am I going to get those mangoes out of those trees? And I go and I get a stick and I break off, the limb of a tree, and then I kind of measure it, and maybe I break it off a little more, and then I pull up a rock to stand on the rock, and then I take aim, and with my dexterity, I'm able to whack the mangoes out of the tree, right? Well, Locke says something interesting has happened here, that we all understand that, for instance, that Jason naturally owns his fingers, right? If you came up to me and you said, "Hey, I would like to take one of your fingers," and I said no, we would side with Jason, right? Hobbes, not necessarily. Remember, he said even somebody else's body, if you want it in the state of nature, you're entitled to it. But Locke thinks that's crazy. Locke thinks that intuitively we all know that Jason owns his fingers, right? And Locke says, well, now, yeah, but Jason can extend. So Jason naturally is the owner of his fingers, and Jason can extend the ownership that he has over his own body into the world around him. And he does this through combining his labor with the things around him. I use my fingers and my muscles to make that stick just the right shape, just the right size, and I use them to aim and to knock the mangoes out of the tree. Well, now the mango that falls over there on the ground, now that naturally, we all understand intuitively, belongs to me. That mango that I've just knocked out of the tree, Locke thinks, is as much part of Jason as Jason's fingers. And we all understand, just by common sense, that you do something wrong to Jason if you take his mango as your own. Now, wait a second, sometimes people say. Jason knocks the mangoes out of the tree, and the mango belongs to him because he has combined his labor with a mango. And let's say the mango falls over there, and I go over and I pick it up. But then you run up to me, you elbow me in the side, you kick me in the shins, you pick the mango up off the ground, and you run off into the forest, right? Haven't you then mixed your labor with the mango, and aren't you then entitled to the mango? And Locke to this says, well, no, because look at the difference between what Jason did to the mango and what you did with the mango. Jason took a mango that belonged to no one, right? The mango was out there in the forest. It was out there in nature. Jason came up. He combined his labor with it. It's now an acquisition. It's now part of Jason. And so the opportunity you've had to acquire the mango has passed. That particular mango is now part of Jason, and you can no longer acquire it by through your own labor. The only way that you can reasonably acquire Jason's mango is that Jason gives it to you or trades it to you, right? In the same way that I would be entitled to give you my finger or my kidney if I want. And it would be wrong, very wrong, to steal my kidney. It's wrong for the same reason Hobbes or Locke thinks to steal Jason's mango, right? Okay, so to review briefly. So we're talking about Locke's idea of the state of nature. This is a state of equality. There are no natural kings or subjects or masters or slaves. It is a state of freedom. We use our abilities to take what we need from nature. It's on these first two that Locke is mostly, if not in complete agreement with Hobbes, their views are compatible so far. Here is going to be the sharp turn away. Locke thinks that, and you can really boil this down to the main difference between Locke and Hobbes, is that Locke thinks that the state of nature is bound by natural rights. It's bound by a natural moral law and by natural rights. And these rights are rights to life, liberty, and possessions. And that we acquire these possessions by We take from nature by acquiring property, and we do that by mixing our labor with things in nature, right? The next thing we want to talk about is this question. This is going to come up again in our next reading in Rousseau, who is going to have a third take on what life is like in the state of nature. He's going to use the same methodology that Hobbes and Locke did. The question we want to consider now is this. Well, Locke tells a story that doesn't sound too bad about life in the state of nature. Sounds pretty good. Why do we leave it? Should we go back to it? Right? Locke's answer to this is, well, that it's true that life is not that bad in the state of nature. But what it is, Locke thinks, is it's inconvenient in the way that camping is inconvenient. It's fun in a way. It's fun to go out and rough it and to really and to feel sort of connected to nature. You're out there in nature and you feel connected to nature in terms of you have to build your own fire. If you want wood, you have to go and cut your own wood. It's work, but that's part of the experience. That's part of what's fun about it is you feel the direct connection between what you work to get and what you have at the end of the day, right? Nonetheless, an important part of this is the inconvenience of it. That you don't, out there you don't have, probably don't have any bars on your phone anymore, right? You don't have your desktop computer certainly, and you don't have a lot of the technological, your Xboxes at home. You don't have a lot of the technology that you have here at the house, right? But Locke thinks that these inconveniences are not so much technological. The inconveniences that he is talking about that drive us to leave the state of nature are not really so much technological, because before we enter into an advanced society, what do we know about technology, right? So Locke instead thinks that what drives us to leave the state of nature, the inconveniences that drive us to leave the state of nature, have to do with three things. One is that they all revolve around the same basic problem. The problem is that you don't live out there on your own for long. Eventually, you have neighbors. There are people around, right? Maybe there are going to be more and more people moving to this little neck of the woods, right? Now, you can go out and you can build a fence around your property, and you can claim for yourself what is yours, right? And people naturally, through their moral common sense, are going to know, okay, well, I don't go over and jump over Jason's fence and hunt or fish over there. But Locke thinks this becomes, as we come into more and more contact with people, there are going to be complications that our common sense isn't going to be able to navigate, right? Take the sort of very classic example of we both have fences around our houses and our estates, right? And you're out hunting one day, and you shoot a deer on your property, but you don't kill it, right? And it runs away, and it ends up on my property, right? And it dies, right? So what do we do? Do you, hop over my fence and go over and pick up the deer and take it back and no harm, no foul, right? Or do we say that, hey, you shot it on your property, but it died on my property, so it's mine, it belongs to me, right? Different people might have different common sense about this, right? And it's not clear what our intuition tells us. What would be really good is if before anybody picked up their rifle and went out hunting, we knew what the rule was. And the rule could be either way, right? It's just as long as we know the rule before we pick up the gun and go hunting, then we can agree beforehand, okay, well, hey, I knew that was the rule, but I went hunting anyway, so the deer is yours, right? Or maybe the rule is, if it dies on you shot it on your property, it dies on mine, I get the haunches and you get the horns or whatever, right? Whatever the rule is, it would be nice to know in advance what the rules are. So that's the first thing we want. We want known laws, as Locke says. The other thing we want is we would like, occasionally there's going to have to be some need for, we're going to have disputes. Reasonable people are going to have disputes over, say, the deer. And if there are no laws that, no clear laws that cover that, we might end up where we want somebody else to act as a third party, to act as a judge, to be the arbiter or the mediator of our little dispute, right? And what would be really nice, these judges are going to be worthless if it's your brother, right? Or it's my cousin who owes me a lot of money, right? We can't have judges who have a stake in the things that they're judging. So what we really want impartial or indifferent judges. And thirdly, we need enforcers. We need people who are going to, once we've written laws, we need people who are going, some group of people who are going to be authorized to go out and enforce the laws. What we can't have is, if you steal my stuff, if you steal my television, we can't have a situation where I round up, I get some of my family members together and we go over to your house and kick the door in and take my TV back. And the reason we can't do this is because while we're over there, we're probably not going to just get my TV back. We're probably going to rough you up a little bit, right? Maybe break some of your stuff. We're going to show you what happens whenever you mess with us, right? Well, then what happens? Well, we beat you up, and then you go and you tell your family, hey, this guy, these guys beat me up, and now we have a feud, right? Now we have this sort of ongoing, escalating violence between our two clans, right? Better that we have some third party. Nobody has to go out and get justice for themselves. I don't have to go out and get my TV back myself. What I do is I call some third party who knows the law. They go out and they get my TV back and bring it back to me, and just my TV. They don't break stuff or burn anything down while they're over there, right? And why would they? They, like our judges, are going to be indifferent to our problems, right? They're not going to know what's personally or have any stake in our dispute, right? So these are then the three things that are missing from the state of nature according to Locke. Out of focus. Okay. They are known laws, indifferent judges, and enforcers. And Locke says that we are pretty good in the state of nature, but as our relationships with other people, as there are more people to have relationships with, and our relationships become more and more complex, our common sense is not enough to navigate our moral disputes, right? So we need these three things, and it is for a want of institutions to establish these three things that we begin to leave the absolute freedom of the state of nature and begin to form a society. We begin to come together as people and form organizations and institutions that are capable of fulfilling these roles, right? Now, when I'm teaching live in class, it's at this point I ask, do these three things sound familiar to anyone? Anyone? Anyone?
Branches of government.
Yes, thank you, my lovely assistant Beth. Somebody might notice, especially if they've recently taken an American history class, well, these look an awful lot like the three branches of the U.S. government, right? The legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch, right? This is no accident. The founding fathers of the United States, Thomas Jefferson in particular, were pretty crazy about John Locke. They were inspired by him in a lot of ways. Jefferson in particular seems very willing to plagiarize or crib from, we might say, John Locke. We've already made reference to in the Declaration of Independence. It says that we have inalienable human rights, among these the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, says Thomas Jefferson. But he might as well have said property, right? I guess the Locke's estate would have sued him if he just said property, right? So anyway, Locke, there's an important reason why Locke sounds so much more appealing to our own American ideas than say Hobbes did, and this is because Locke his fingerprints are kind of all over our U.S. Constitution, not literally, but his intellectual fingerprints. Okay, so now let's talk about what kind of government Locke thinks is capable of establishing these institutions. Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about a little more specifically what kind of government Locke thinks we ought to have. Hobbes ended up being very straightforward about this. He thought that we needed an absolute monarchy. Locke's answer is going to be a lot more complex than that. Before we get to that, though, the attendance password for today is summer. So summer, like the weather, the season. Anyway, so let's talk about what kind of government Locke has in mind here. In the first case, we need to remember that most basic and the most important thing here are those natural rights that we talked about. Those are going to be the whole impetus behind, the whole reason for existing, the whole reason for our government and our society to exist. We begin to be social beings only because we want to have certain kinds of protections of our natural rights in our interactions, right? So we need to remember that at all times once we have established a government, because if a government isn't protecting our natural rights, or if it isn't doing it sufficiently, then it's not fulfilling its purpose. And we should maybe think of a different kind of government, right? Now, any government that we have is it must, Locke thinks, establish those legislative, executive, and judicial powers that we talked about before. That's the stuff that we really need. Locke is very concerned. This is going to be a very important concept, or a very important idea going forward with people in his who are his philosophical forebears, right? Locke is very suspicious about any form of government that goes beyond those three functions, right? Any government and any government that is a government must protect our natural rights. And Locke thinks that it should only protect our natural rights. Anything it does beyond establishing those fundamental powers, he thinks is going to be tyranny. It's going to be people infringing upon our fundamental freedoms, right? Because an important idea for Locke is that, remember, the state of nature is this, in many ways, wonderful, very, very free place. And that freedom of the state of nature for Locke is our birthright as human beings. We are entitled to be free. And it is only begrudgingly, Locke thinks, that we begin to form societies. And we need to make sure that we try to preserve as much as possible the freedom that we have in the state of nature whenever we enter into these societies. So by definition, a government that's making more laws than are necessary is going to be restricting our freedoms more than is necessary. And Locke is not in favor of that, right? Once again, very, very American idea, right? And Locke thinks also that we need to remember that the powers of government come from the consent of the people that the government is governing, right? It is the people who offer the power of government and who give that authority. And Locke thinks, again, very important idea, that this consent, that a government can only rule with the consent of the people, and that this consent is retractable, that the people can take it back, that we can withdraw that consent, and we withdraw it in the form of, well, one form is revolution, right? Now, remember, Hobbes thought that all revolutions were inherently evil, right, or inherently wrong. Locke thinks, well, no, some revolutions can be good. There could be a good revolution. And the main difference between their thinking is, remember, that Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is absolutely the worst conditions that anybody can live in. Even bad government is better than no government at all. Locke, on the other hand, disagrees. He thinks that, well, no, the state of nature isn't that bad, and if from time to time people need to live in a state of nature or get along just through their relationships between their sort of immediate family members and community, on the way to establishing some sort of larger governmental institution, then so be it, right? Maybe we need to live in the woods for a while, maybe. But we'll come back, right? And life in the state of nature, again, isn't that bad, right? So the power of government comes from the consent of the people, and that consent, according to Locke, can be withdrawn in the form of revolution at the very least. This, by the way, at the time that Locke is writing in the late 1600s, just a few decades after the English Civil War, this is a pretty revolution, no pun intended, a pretty revolutionary idea, right? That hey, anytime they want, the people can just are entitled to just pick up their guns and throw the guy out of the castle, or legislating house or wherever, right? It's a pretty radical idea, right? It should be no surprise that in the late 1600s, when Locke publishes the two treatises of government, which the readings for today came from, that's the book that that the readings came from for today. He publishes the two treatises of government anonymously. Lost my word, right? He publishes them anonymously. He doesn't want the heat from people knowing that it's him, right? Particularly the political heat. You can imagine if you're the king, the idea that people can just they're morally entitled to just pick up their guns anytime they want and throw you out is not something that's terribly appealing to you, right? And in fact, Locke has a lot of besides this, has a lot of unpopular relationships and political relationships, personal relationships, and political ideas that he spends a lot of time in exile in the later part of his life, right? He has to flee England because things get too hot, right? So, that's kind of the outline of what the kind of government that Locke thinks, or at least the responsibilities of government, according to Locke. But what kind of government, what form of government does Locke endorse? And so on this issue that he's surprisingly, having been such an influence on our American system, Locke is surprisingly nonpartisan about what kind of government he endorses. He thinks that there could be a few forms of government that protect our natural rights and establish appropriate institutions, and a monarchy could be one of them. It would have to be a monarchy that's limited by some sort of parliamentarian body that helps writes the laws. But the king could constitute the executive branch of the government, right, and be the one who's responsible for enforcing the laws, as long as the judicial and the legislative branches exist, and they exist at least somewhat independently, right? The idea of a separation of powers that's going to be so central and essential to the U.S. Constitution. The idea of a clear separation of these powers into different bodies is not quite there yet with Locke, but will come from other people in the coming decades. So there could be a monarchy that coexists with a government that fills these roles. It could be a straight democracy, and there's no way for our modern sensibility to quite grasp how radical an idea a democratic form of government seemed in the late 1600s. There had not been a democracy since the Roman times, and it had not worked out well for the Romans. Very famously, it had not worked out so well. The democracy had proven very weak, and had ended up going through periods of chaos, followed by very strong, ruthless rulers. Right. So the idea in the late 1600s that there could be a democratic government that is stable and strong is a pretty out there idea. Then again, by the time Locke is writing, it's clear the role of the Parliament in the English political system has become central and well established, and so people are beginning to ask this question. Well, wait a second. If the Parliament is one of the best functioning branches of our government, and we really like it, so why can't all the governmental institutions be subject to democracy? So it's out there. It's beginning to sort of circulate, but it's again, a couple generations away from where Locke is. Much safer for him personally, politically, philosophically, to say that, well, yeah, we're still better off with the government we have, right? A monarchy that is limited by the Parliament, right? So the best form of government, surprise, you're soaking in it, right? Mm-hmm. That is an old joke, or an old reference. So, what else do I want to say about Locke for now? Good question. Glad you asked it. One thing I forgot to mention, a little footnote here, but it's important. This often comes up when we're kind of laying out Locke's idea of what life is like in the state of nature. So go back to when I was talking about acquiring property. I was talking about acquiring property by mixing my labor with it, right? So I knocked down the mango. The mango no longer belongs to anybody, to everybody. It now belongs to one person in particular because it was my hands and my strength that knocked the mango out of the tree. Somebody, and I'm adding this at the end because there was, there were not students out there to raise their hands to ask these kinds of questions, but somebody will inevitably ask during this section of the class, well, what if I do this? What if I say, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a wall or a fence all the way around the mango grove, right? A big, beautiful wall, right, with a big, beautiful gate. And I'm going to charge people to come in and get mangoes, right? And you say, well, what right do you have to do that? And you say, well, look at the wall. I built it, right? And this is such a hit that maybe I find the only source of clean water on the island, and I build a wall around that too, right? And I bet I can, whatever I charge you for, the mangoes, I can probably charge you 10 times that for clean water, right? Speaking of clean water. So what about this, Locke? Well, Locke says that you can't do this, or you're not morally entitled to do this. It would be wrong to do this, to build a wall around the only clean source of water on the island and to charge money for that. And the reason why, he says, is that the acquisition from nature, the acquisition of property from nature, is limited by this little proviso, this little rule that he makes up. That he says that, well, you can take from nature by mixing your labor with it, but you have to leave as much and as good for everybody else. So you can take one mango, you can maybe even take 2 mangoes, but you can't take all the mangoes, because by taking all the mangoes, you are even more than you can eat. You are creating an artificial shortage, right? And that doesn't leave as much in as good for everybody else. Same way, building a wall around the water doesn't leave as much in as good for everybody else. So we are entitled to take to meet our own needs. We are not entitled to take to create artificial shortages or monopolies, or take more than we can have because we want to sell them to other people, right? That would be, he thinks, wrong. So I bring that up and I emphasize that not just to be fussy, not just because I actually in grad school wrote a paper on that very topic, the as much and as good proviso in Locke, but actually that's going to come up again in a little bit in a couple of readings down the road. We talk about Ake, this idea of whether or not people, governments and societies that think of themselves as Lockean, like us, are entitled to, for instance, go into other countries and just sort of take and take and take all of their resources, and just say, hey man, it's capitalism, right? Yes, we own the mine, but you native people, you can work in the mine for 10 cents an hour. Anyway, but we will get to that a little bit later. So anyway, that is my Locke lecture. So I did not. Once again, my assistant comes through. So here are the notes for this section. So Locke's government exists to enforce our natural rights. It does this by establishing executive, legislative, and judicial powers. Its authority comes from the consent of the governed, and this consent can be withdrawn. It can be withdrawn in the form of revolution, or if you're a democratic system, it can be withdrawn in the form of going out to vote. Right? You vote for voted for somebody one time, and then you say, hey, I don't like that guy, so you go and you vote him out of office. That would be as founding fathers of the U.S. will observe a couple of generations later, that would be the most peaceful form of the transition of power, right? And for Locke, the essential functions of government could be realized by different forms of government, like democracy or monarchy or other forms of government. So, but as long as it is effectively establishing these institutions to protect the natural rights of human beings, then Locke thinks that it's going to be, generally speaking, just. It's still also going to have to limit itself to just protecting those rights. Okay, so that's my Locke lecture. I will see you guys later.